tonight our Bible study will be in Daniel chapter 8. This is lesson 20 of our series from the Kings to the King. It's in the third division of our study, the final division of our study, the intertestament times. And so we have made a very big point of saying that God was silent during this period. Sometimes it's called the period of biblical silence. For round numbers, that's 400 years. If we want to get real particular, it's not quite that long. Malachi could have been a little bit later. There's a large window in Malachi could have been. And we really end the biblical silence not in the time of the Gospels, but really about 30 years before the Gospels, when the angel appears to Zechariah and to Mary and to Joseph. So it's really closer to 320 or 30 years of Bible silence, but 400 is pretty close, and there's a reason why people pick that number. But when we talk about Bible silence, again, we want to say that God was silent during that period. He was not at all silent about that period. So we'll be studying our outline of the intertestament period as studies of the book of Daniel. Now, I always like to say there are two parts to the book of Daniel. There's the part, the first half, the story part, not that the others aren't good stories, and biographical parts, where you basically have, I call it, the vacation Bible school part of Daniel. Every one of the stories in the first 6 chapters of Daniel make a real good evening or afternoon of vacation Bible school. The Hebrew children, the statue of gold, of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the humiliation of Nebuchadnezzar, and his learning humility, which is, if you only got 5 days, that's the one that gets left off. The handwriting on the wall, and man, the kids have some neat crafts for that. And then lastly, you get to end with Daniel 6, the Daniel in the lion's den. So Daniel, the first 6 chapters, every one of those is a vacation Bible school worthy story. They're easy to understand and get good principles from. At the same time, there's depth there for the adults to learn as well. And they're just, some of the most memorable stories in the Bible. And so then there's the second half of the book of Daniel, the part that nobody ever studies. And that's the part we're in right now. So if the first half of Daniel, the biographical section, is the vacation Bible school part of Daniel, we are now in the part of Daniel I like to call the seminary part of Daniel. Because if you don't go to seminary, you may never study it. Because a lot of people avoid it. It doesn't have the memorable plot developments and the memorable cast of characters of the first half of the book. And there are things in it that are quite complicated. And beyond that, about the only people who seem to spend much time in it outside of seminaries and serious systematic study are people who have wild theories about the end of days and who just relish to say things like times, time, and a half time, and the sacrifice is cut off, and the desolation will come for 1,260 days. People who just love to say those type of things, they get into studying the latter part of Daniel. And I got to say, most of the people who love to say those phrases, they're probably not all that biblically accurate. So we're in a section of Daniel that is going to be unfamiliar to us, maybe about as unfamiliar to us as any part of Scripture, except for, I don't know, the latter half or the latter third of the book of Psalms. Just somebody tell me, just pick any one of your favorite Psalms that is numbers between 78 and 103. And everybody's like, So other than that, latter third of the book of Psalms, I don't know of any part of the Scriptures that are just about as unfamiliar territory to us as this section of the book of Daniel. Maybe the middle part of Isaiah, because that seems to get kind of repetitive and confusing, at least to me. So we're in an unfamiliar part of the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, though, God gives a vision of the future for starting almost in Daniel's time, and which will occur in Daniel's lifetime. Daniel will see some of the things that begin in chapter 8. He's going to see the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Now in chapter 7, he saw that coming in great detail. And because of the way the book of Daniel is structured, that chapters 1 through 6, chapters 1 through 6 are chronological in themselves. And then chapters 7 through 12 are chronological in themselves. But the timeline of the two parts overlap. It doesn't go 1 through 6, then 7 through 12. It's 1 through 6, and I'll put this, and then it's 7 through 12. And so there's kind of an overlap as one is still going while the other begins. And so Daniel chapter 7 is actually about 12 years before Daniel chapter 5. And then Daniel chapter 8 comes just a couple years after Daniel chapter 7. So the vision here that Daniel sees, Daniel is going to see this vision 9 years before the things of chapter 5. The handwriting on the wall at the end of the Persian Empire is 9 years in the future. They're in their last king. There will not be another king of Babylon. I don't know that that was fully revealed yet, but there's no other king. We're in the days of the last king, and that seems to be why that God starts to show Daniel these things. We're in the last king of Babylon. He has just begun his reign. 12 years after, or 11 years after chapter 7, 9 years or so after chapter 8, will be his last night, which is that handwriting on the wall incident. Then fast forward another couple of years to the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, when you have that last and maybe the most famous story of all of Daniel, the lion's den story. And so, interesting enough, we are several years, we're about a decade before chapter 5 and chapter 6, even though we're in chapter 8. Because we're in the beginning of the prophecy section. We are nearing the end of the biographical sections. All right, so with that having been said, we'll note again that even though this is prophetic section, it still happens in real time, in real place, in real history. And so I'll go ahead and put on for y'all, that's not it, the charts for tonight. So here was our title slide, Daniel's second vision. It's the third vision of the book, but the first vision was by Nebuchadnezzar. And so he saw the golden statue, and then Daniel saw the, in chapter 7, he saw the vision of the four beasts, and then one like the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days. And now in chapter 8, Daniel's going to see just two of the beasts. And the two of the beasts will start. We'll start with the beast that's the Medes and the Persians. Then we're going to quickly get to the beast that is the Greeks. And he's going to come flying in, and he's basically going to stomp the other one to death. He's just going to trounce on him and bounce on him until he is done for. And so, let's see. There we go. Visions of coming kingdoms. So, again, we'll note that this is God's outline of future history shown to Daniel. We do note that it's very anchored in time. So, again, it's not the biographical section, but we're still in the realm of historical reality. As we start the lesson, as we start chapter 8, we notice it's the third year of King Belshazzar. The vision appeared after the one that happened earlier, though that was chapter 7. And he says, I saw the vision as I watched. I was in the fortress city of Susa in the province of Elam. I saw in a vision that I was beside the Ulai Canal, and I looked and there was a ram beside the canal. So in Susa, there's a vision by the canal, and Daniel sees it in a particular year and in a particular place. Now, Susa will become important to us, right? Where do we know the city of Susa from? Anybody? And I can't see everybody because I'm screen sharing, but why is Susa, why is that an important city? Right. That is going to be the capital city of the Medes and the Persians. So here was a major city of Babylon, a important regional city, and a strong fortress. Also, the city of Susa is only, I think, 75 or 80 miles as the crow flies from the Persian Gulf, but it's at elevation. And it is one of the more pleasant places to be. And so you think about what would we like to live in Kuwait or Basra area in Iraq. It's just inhospitable, horrific, oppressive heat and weather. And so Susa, not all that far away, but at elevation up in the mountains. And so it's just a much nicer place to be. And so a provincial town and fortress for the Babylonians, later the capital for the Persians. And maybe that's one reason why he got the vision there. All right, so first he sees, standing there by the canal, he sees a great ram. And this ram had 2 horns in verse 3. But what we find is that one of those horns was longer than the other. And this seems to represent in the fact of the Medo-Persian Empire that one side of that was a whole lot stronger of an empire than the other, or a stronger partner in the empire. Through most of history, what do we know this kingdom of the Medes and the Persians as? Because if you read your history book, you're going to read about the Medes and the Persians a lot. Well, you'll read about them at first, but through most history, and especially as it relates to the Greeks, and like in the book of Esther, it'll be the Persians. So it seems like early on, the Medes were sort of the stronger partner, but through most of their history, these people would simply be known as the Persians. So whenever our Greek history gets together with these folks, it's always the Persians. So we have this unequal kingdom, but it was doing pretty well. It did everything it wanted for a while. And so it says it went charging west and north and south, and no animal could stand against it. And there was nothing to rescue from its power. It did whatever it wanted and became great. And so here is this kingdom. Here is this kingdom that can, in 3 different directions. So the only way it doesn't go is east. And historically, the Persian Empire butted up against India and didn't go real far into modern day India. Somewhere in what is now Pakistan, the Persian Empire played out. And but it went north, it went west, it went south. And so that's a pretty good state of affairs when your kingdom can go in 3 directions, whatever it wants. And basically, it did this for about 200 years. From the time they took over the Babylonians in the year 539 until they were conquered by Alexander the Great, which is in 331 BC, so 218 years. So for 200 years, round number, for 200 years, this is the world empire. This is the people who dominate the scene and do what they want. About the only thing they couldn't do is they couldn't defeat all the Greeks when the Greeks got together. Of course, if you read your classical period of Greek history, how often did the Greeks get together? It wasn't very often. And so this great beast, again, we had back in chapter 7, we had the beast who was compared to a bear who just did whatever he wanted, and he had the ribs in his mouth. So this is that same kingdom. As we're later be told, we're going to be told directly at the end of chapter 8. We're going to be told which kingdoms we're talking about. So there is no guesswork for us in guessing as to which kingdoms these are going to be. So we have the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, this unequal horns, but 200 years of dominance. Well, then all of a sudden, there's a new thing coming, and it's, depending on your translation, it's a male goat, it's a he-goat, or some kind of thing. We're just going to call it what we normally call male goats around here. We're just going to call it the billy goat. So there's going to be a billy goat coming, and this guy is moving. He is moving so fast, it says, he came from the west on the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. So that's the first thing about our billy goat. Our billy goat moves so fast, he doesn't touch the ground. And then the other unique thing about this billy goat, before he gets there, is this billy goat just has one conspicuous horn. So unlike a normal goat with two horns, he's only got one, but man, it must be something, because it is a conspicuous horn. So here comes this beast, this billy goat with the conspicuous horn, and we're going to be told a little bit later on, we're going to be told absolutely that this is the Greeks. So it's not a matter of interpretation, it's something we're told directly in the text. This one is the Greeks. Now, we might not know this, but in the ancient world, a goat was the symbol of Greece going way, way back. And the Greek word for goat, which is igos, is the word that we get to, even for today, the name of the Aegean Sea. So if you remember your Mediterranean geography, on one side of Greece toward Italy is the Aegean Sea, the Adriatic Sea. On the other side of Greece toward Turkey, modern Turkey, is the Aegean Sea, still called that to this day. And so literally it means the Goat Sea. And so one side of the sea that Greece was on is called the Goat Sea. So it's not in any way unique in the ancient world to identify the Greeks with goats. If they had, if they had team logos like a football team, they would definitely be the Greek goats. That's who they'd be. All right, so the goats are coming, or the singular here, but the goat is coming with one really big horn. And he's coming so fast, he's hardly touching the sea. Now, in chapter 7, the beast that represented Greece was a leopard. And how fast is the leopard? It's the fastest land animal. But beyond that, in chapter 7, the leopard, in that case, that beast had 4 wings. And so he's a leopard with 4 wings. Now, you can't outrun a leopard. How are you going to do against a leopard with 4 wings? So, again, the speed is emphasized. And so we know how fast Alexander the Great conquered the world. Was he 32 or so when he conquered everything? I think he took the kingdom from his father when his father was killed when he was 18 or 19. And about 3 years later, he came out of Greece with a unified army of all the Greek city-states and all those people from Macedonia. And within 10 years of coming out of Greece, he had conquered everything that there was to conquer. So he went through Tyre and Sidon, and there's prophecies that would occur in Ezekiel 28 and in Zechariah 9. And then he came down to Jerusalem, and we'll speak about that a little more toward the end of the lesson. They didn't fight him at all. They opened the doors and said, "Hey, we've read about you in our book right here. Thanks for coming. You're welcome to be here." And then he went to Egypt, and he quickly conquered Egypt. And then he went back up through Jerusalem and Damascus, and he went down the Fertile Crescent, and he conquered Babylon in just a couple of years. And then he ended up invading India. And he conquered about 25 or 30% of India. And finally, his men says, "Hey, we've been with this war thing for 15 years. How about we go home and enjoy the spoils of this?" And so they did. And he went back to Babylon. And there, shortly thereafter, he died of a fever. And so anyway, just one of the most amazing set of military victories. He basically never lost a battle. Never lost a big one. There were some setbacks, and there were times when things didn't go as well as they wanted. And there were a few times where things took longer than they wanted. But basically, he came out of Greece, and for about as fast as you can walk over all that territory, he conquered every bit of it. So when this beast with this horn comes up, it says he was enraged. And so he comes in and he's just angry. And so he came to the two-horned ram, verse 6, and he attacked him, it says, with a savage fury. In other translations, we'll talk about him coming in a rage. So here he is in a rage and a fury. He comes up to that ram that represents the Medes and the Persians. He struck him. He broke both the horns. The ram couldn't stand up against him. So the goat threw him to the ground, and the goat trampled on him. And there was no one to rescue him from his power. So he basically just stomped him to death. And then he became even more arrogant when he got powerful. And then he had one big horn. His one big horn gets broken off. And then in its place will come four horns that go to the four winds of heaven. All right, so this seems to be symbolic. Of course, the single horn, the fury, and the speed. That's Alexander and his conquering. And then when Alexander is defeated, or excuse me, when he dies, there's a couple of year period, maybe 8 or 9 or 10, where his generals try through a regency approach and a cooperative effort to keep this newly formed empire together. But then it ends up within a few years breaking into four parts. And there's four generals of Alexander who each end up getting a part of the kingdom in different areas. And they are now going to be these four horns that the prophecy takes up. And there's going to be two of them that are important to the Bible story, to the people of God. There's going to be the rulers in Egypt. And that was a family descended from the general Ptolemy. And there's going to be a family that rules in Damascus. And they are descendant of a general whose name is Seleucus. So there becomes the Seleucid family and the Ptolemy family. Of course, we know Jerusalem is about halfway between Damascus and Cairo. Well, actually, it was Damascus and Alexandria. Of course, why'd they name it Alexandria? They named after Alexander. About halfway between Alexandria and Cairo is Jerusalem. There is a period where the control of Jerusalem is going to pass back and forth between the two empires that get established. At one point, I think, it changed hands one time, 4 times in a year, because there was so much fighting. But there's 2 or 3 major times of transition where it goes back and forth between these two kingdoms. But these 4 kingdoms are going to be the descendants of Alexander, and they are going to be, the 2 of them are going to be, the ones who are important to the Bible story. So again, 4 horns became up where the one was broken. They became conspicuous horns in its place, and they went to the 4 winds of heaven. So here it is that God sees not just the coming kingdom. He sees the breakup of this newly conquered land into 4 different kingdoms, and we'll see through the rest of Bible history and secular history of this period going down to just about the time of the birth of Christ, the interaction between these 2 kingdoms with each other, and then the coming power of the Romans. And so your story of Cleopatra is included here because the Ptolemies like to name people Ptolemy if they were men, and they like to name them Cleopatra if they were women. So the Cleopatra we know from history is the last one of that Ptolemy family. She's actually Cleopatra the 7th. And then the Seleucids, they like to name everybody either Seleucus or the name of Seleucus' father. His father was named Antiochus. And so there's a whole lot of rulers in that household that are known as Antiochus. We'll know especially the 4th, because he's important to the Bible story. Also, when the gospel is spread in the New Testament in the book of Acts, how many different cities are named Antioch? And they're all named that after Seleucid's father, Antiochus. So, all right. Now, we might take a little bit of a pause before we go into chapter 8, verse 9, because among those 4 horns, there's going to be a little horn that grows and becomes a bit of a problem. And that'll be an important part of the next part of the prophecy. We'll also note the similarity. These 4 beasts with horns coming and going and horns replacing horns and becoming problems. Where else do we read about this exact kind of situation? It's all over the book of Revelation, isn't it? It's all over the book of Revelation. And so when you read the book of Revelation, if you have some knowledge of Daniel, then you'll be on familiar territory, at least with quite a bit of it. All right, at that point, I will pause, and I'm glad to see no one's in the waiting room, or they were in the waiting room and gave up, as I couldn't see that while I had the chart up. But questions or comments as we pause there after verse 8. Yes, sir, Steve. That's true. In Alexandria, there's a couple of things the Ptolemies did. I can't remember if it was the first one or second one. It was early on that one of those fellows wanted a book, or wanted a library with all the books he could possibly get. And as the Greek people had gone into these eastern lands, there was a lot of books they didn't understand. And so they wanted everything as possible translated into Greek. And so a committee of Jewish scholars, we'd probably call most of them rabbis, who did speak Greek, they worked on the translation, and they made a Greek translation of the Old Testament for the Library of Alexandria. That spread and became commonly known. And by the time we get to the end of this period, New Testament period, we have a whole lot of Jewish people who cannot speak Hebrew anymore. Of course, they're already speaking Aramaic by the end of the Old Testament, but by the time of the New Testament, some of them can't even speak that. They're totally Greek acculturated, and they live in Greek cities. And that's one of the things. You have a very common culture, and you have a common language to the world. And we talk about those facts when we talk about Galatians 4:4, the fullness of time, that these things were prepared so that there was a knowledge of God and a readily available way to check the prophecies by the time the gospel came. And so generally, when we study the Bible, we have a pretty generous view of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Of course, that may be because they didn't rule Jerusalem directly and get in all the trouble and conflict with the Jews. But they did have the word translated, the Old Testament, and also it's a reason why when they need to flee from Herod in the story of the birth of Jesus, why Egypt is a safe place to go, because it's under a different administration, it's a different set of people, and Herod's rule under the very complex sub-kings that the Romans set up, Herod's rule didn't extend down there, and he wasn't able to do anything. Up in Damascus, where the Greek rulers often fought with the Jews, especially the war that we call the Maccabean Rebellion, and what they did to defile intentionally the temple of God, which when they get rid of that and put the Jewish system back into place, which is celebrated even today through Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, rededication. We have a really bad view of the Seleucids. We have a much more generous view of the Ptolemies. We're also thankful the Ptolemies, at one point they I forget what it was. It was some kind of big public works. I don't know if it was a temple complex or some obelisk or something. At one point they set up one of these big obelisks, and they wanted it to be remembered that they did it, that they were the benefactors who erected it. And so they had it inscribed in stone in Greek that they did this. And they also had the local Egyptian priest inscribed the exact same story in Hebrew. Actually, not Hebrew, in Egyptian. They're Egyptians. So that was the stone called the Rosetta Stone. And that's how come they were able to break the code and figure out how to translate it, hieroglyphics. Because for a couple of centuries, we couldn't figure out hieroglyphics. And they found a stone where the rulers had said, write this down that we did this for you, and we were the benefactors, and write it in several languages. And so that gave them the key for translation. All right, so in your guide on the second page of this lesson, page 82, there's a few additional historical facts, most of which we don't really need to cover tonight any more than we have. There's also a timeline of notable rulers, if you want to know some of the names and the rulers of this time. Again, we'll note that God saw these things coming, even though we don't have a prophet on the scene who comments as they occur, but God foretold their occurrence. All right, now, amongst those four horns, there comes one who gets to be a problem. And so a little horn emerges in verse 9. It says, from one of them, so from one of the new four horns, from one of them a little horn emerged, and it grew extensively to the south and the east, and toward the beautiful land. Well, it's pretty easy to understand what Daniel means here by the beautiful land, right? That's the land that's Palestine. That's where the Jews live. That's the place of the temple. And this one he's talking about goes there from the east, it goes toward the south and toward the east. And so he's going to pick up Jerusalem as part of his territory. So the Ptolemies first controlled Jerusalem and Palestine, and then came those in Damascus of the Seleucids. And so they're going to get in conflict with the Jews in Jerusalem. And it grew as far as as high as the heavenly army, and it made some of the army and some of the stars fall to earth and trampled them. All right. Well, we know that language again from Revelation, don't we? The dragon who can, reach his tail up to the sky, and so we don't take that any more literally, I don't think, in Revelation than we do here. We're just talking about something that becomes glorious, something that becomes full of pride and might, and something that's really powerful. He acts arrogantly against the prince of the heavenly army, and it revokes the sacrifice, the regular sacrifice, and overthrew the place of the sanctuary. And in the rebellion, the army was given up together with the regular sacrifice, and the horn threw truth to the ground and was successful in what he did. And so here is a disaster. Here we've got somebody who sets their eye on the beautiful land. He goes down to the beautiful land, obviously Jerusalem, the area of the temple. He's arrogant against heaven. He's arrogant against the truth. He's arrogant against the people there. And he starts throwing his weight around. And he ends the regular sacrifice. Well, there's only one period recorded in secular history between the time of the restoration of the temple and the beginning of the sacrifices and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. There's only one time recorded when the sacrifices stopped. And there was about a 3-year period, and some people can, because of what's said later about the 2300 evenings and mornings, there's some people who actually will find in one of the secular references a period of just slightly over three years. I'm not sure if the secular reference actually nails it quite down that tight, but it does say about 3 years where they don't have a sacrifice. And so it's pretty obvious that this prophecy is about the one time that the sacrifice is stopped. And that becomes an absolutely momentous and maybe the most important thing just about in the whole Intertestament period. And it directly leads to the Maccabean revolt. And so Judas Maccabee, right? Judas the Hammer. And I got to say, if you guys are handing out nicknames, preferably not posthumously in the case of Judas, but if you're going to be handing out nicknames, I wouldn't mind being the Hammer. It's a pretty good name, like Charles Martel, right? The great French leader, also known as Charlemagne. That's Charles the Hammer. So we got Charles the Hammer, we got Judas the Hammer. There's enough room in this situation for Jay the Hammer, right? Maybe not. All right, anyway, the Hammer's a pretty good name. Also, it's also my wrestling name when I put the tights on for the weekend shows. Okay, so Judas the Hammer. The things that the Maccabean revolt ends up causing are almost too numerous to count. And the only other single fact in the intertestament period, well, I guess maybe there's two more. Switching to Greek. That almost everybody knows Greek. It's hard to overstate that. The influence of the synagogues. We end the Old Testament without synagogues. We start the New Testament with synagogues. And the third thing is the thing that things that happen because Judas and his relatives, they are successful after this oppression. And it was a brief but terrible oppression by the Greek rulers out of Damascus. It was so bad that, and the leader who caused it was so bad, Antiochus IV, that the Jews just knew him as Antiochus the Wicked. His own people called him Antiochus the Crazed. And so when your own people call you the crazy one, you know, so this oppression causes the Jews to, for a 100-ish year period, 120 years, to have an independent kingdom. The Jews in the intertestament period are going to have their own independent kingdom. Now, what do you do when you get your own independent kingdom? Well, you do whatever you want. And so the Edomites, which by late period are known as the Idumeans, the Jews turn their army onto them and they conquer the Idumeans. And so Edom is no more by the New Testament. Edom is a big part of the Old Testament. Where's Edom in the New Testament? Like the prophecy said, it's going and ain't coming back. But there was one of the royal families of the Edomites, the Idumeans, one of the members of the royal family. He had still money and position, and even after his kingdom was conquered, and he married into some Jewish families, and that gives us the whole family of Herods. The Herods come into the Jewish family through Edom. Not only that, they don't just turn their army toward the Edomites, they turn their army toward the Samaritans. In the New Testament, you know, as we end the Old Testament, in Nehemiah and Ezra, we don't find the Jews and the Samaritans getting along too well, do we? We don't. But are they literally trying to kill each other? No. But during the period of the Greek rule, when the Jews were being oppressed, guess who joined in and helped? The Samaritans helped the Greeks oppress the Jews. When the Jews beat the Greeks out and got their own kingdom, where do you think they turned their army? To the Samaritans. And they killed a ton of them. And they made the rest get circumcised. And they made them, to a greater degree, follow the law of Moses. And so once the Samaritans get free of the Jews after that, guess how much the Samaritans like the Jews? Well, none at all. But where do they live? Right in the middle of them, right? So why are there all these Jews in the Galilee in the north who live north of the Samaritans, and all these Jews in Jerusalem to the south who live south of the Samaritans, but the Samaritans get the part in the middle? Because in all this fighting, they were able to hang on to the hill country. But they got driven out of Galilee, and Jews went up and settled that. Because there were periods in the Old Testament, or in the Restoration period, where there were no Jews up in Galilee. But after they had their own kingdom, and several hundred years to grow, they had enough people to send up there and hold that. Not only that, the Samaritans, excuse me, the Maccabeans and their descendants, they were priests. They make themselves the kings. Because, I mean, if we set the country free, who should rule it? Well, we should, right? Why is Washington our first president? He won the war, right? And what if Washington would have wanted to be a king? We might have got one, but he didn't want to be a king, and we're glad for it. But Washington got to be the first president of real power. I know there's Articles of Confederation in there for a couple of years. History's always messy. But Washington gets to be the first president because he won the war. Well, who gets to be the king of a new kingdom of Judah in Jerusalem? Well, this family of priests who led the war, right? Well, in the Old Testament, was there supposed to be a family of kings? Yes. And also, guess who set themselves up as the high priest? This family that won the war. So who's going to tell them they can't be the king, and who's going to tell them that their family can't be the high priest? Well, nobody is, because why? They won the war. All right. What if you're a Jewish person who says, we have a king, but he's got to come from the lineage of David, and we have a high priestly family, and you're not it? Would you object to these people taking over that kind of power for themselves? You might. And what do we call the group of people who formed up in opposition to this power structure during the time of independence? We call them Pharisees. This is where the Pharisees began. The Pharisees began with objecting to the descendants of the Maccabees setting themselves up as kings and priests in Jerusalem, because they said, you're not the kings that are the right kings, and you're not the right family of priests. And they were right about that. They just absolutely were. But they're the king and priest. What are you going to do? All right, so all of these things, like I say, this oppression, and we're fixing to study the oppression, this oppression of the Jews that lasted 5 to 10 years in a serious fashion. This oppression of the Jews and the reaction that it causes set the stage for so much of the Jewish history to come. And we're going to see the prophecy foresee it. One other thing I'll just mention for future. In the New Testament, we have a lot of different political parties of Jews. And one of them is a zealot. Where did the zealots come from? There's no zealots in the Old Testament, are there? They're not. Well, when the Jews lose their political independence, when they lose their kingdom to the Romans, guess what some of the Jews want again? The Jews want their own kingdom back. So the Jews who want their own kingdom become the zealots. And all through the New Testament, and then in the history of the New Testament age up to the destruction of Jerusalem, we keep seeing these strange things like these Jews who think they can fight the Roman Empire and win. And what do you want to say whenever you see in history somebody says, I think we'll fight the Romans? What do you want to tell them? No, you don't. You don't want to fight the Romans. But why did they think that they could do it? Because the Maccabees had done it. And they're like, we just do that again. And that was only, 200 years ago, right? We can remember that, right? Think about how much of our political history from 200 years ago is still alive. If Andrew Jackson ran today on his platform, he'd win again. There's no doubt. And so 200 years before, they had done this, and now they're saying, hey, we can do this again. All right. But that is probably a little late to get to that oppression. But just realize that God sees this oppression coming. God sees the response to this oppression and some of these things that are going to happen. So again, what is it we say over and over and over? God is silent during this period of history. But as we read the book of Daniel, we can tell he's not silent about it. And those events of 165 AD, which is where we're down to, those events are 400 years, 350, 400 years after Daniel. And Daniel sees them coming.